This video is sponsored by DataCamp. Understanding data analysis is a critical 21st century skill in every industry. Keep your analytical skills sharp with a subscription to DataCamp. More on them in a bit. Save us all the humiliation of putting our feet in our mouths if we're ever lucky enough to visit the topic of today's video. We're offering the following public service announcement. Though it can be spelled with AC or AW, as Michiganers are fond of pointing out, Mackinac is always pronounced with the R sound at the end. You're welcome. That said, Mackinac Bridge is a massive 60-year-old suspension bridge spanning the Straits of Mackinac between Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas. Part of Interstate 75, it connects Mackinac City in the south with St. Ignace in the north and sits near the junction of Lake Michigan to the west and Lake Huron to the east. With a shoreline-to-shoreline length of just under 5 miles, or about 8 kilometers, Big Mac is the longest bridge of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. In addition, at 3,800 feet or 1,158 meters, its main span is the third longest in the United States and the 20th longest worldwide. The Mackinac Bridge is often compared to other behemoths like California's Golden Gate and San Francisco Oakland Bay bridges, but though the former has a longer span between towers, it's less than half as long from end to end. Likewise, at nearly 8.5 miles long, that's 13.6 kilometers, the San Francisco Oakland Bay Bridge is significantly longer, but it has an anchorage in the middle. Though construction wasn't completed until the summer of 1957, the idea took root more than 70 years before, when industry, tourism, and population were beginning to boom in Michigan. However, before the bridge was built, the only way to travel between peninsulas were circuitous road routes and state-operated ferries, the latter of which featured long wait times, hair-raising journeys during inclement weather, and only seasonal service. The word Mackinac is the shortened English version of a longer and more difficult to pronounce Native American term that loosely translates into Great Turtle. Historians and linguists disagree about the word's origins, but it may refer to the shape of the nearby Mackinac Islands. Whatever the case, thanks to abundant fish and game and a myriad of navigable waterways, the region supported a number of thriving Native American groups that often congregated in and around Mackinac for trade and to interact socially. Not surprisingly, however, when the first settlers of European descent began showing up in the late 1600s, the region's vast forests and mineral resources became the objects of great desire, though it wouldn't be until a century later when exploitation really began on a large scale. Ultimately, more settlers followed, cities and towns were established, and later railways were built. Trucks and automobiles eventually burst onto the scene too, and as early as the first decade of the 20th century, the demand for a safe, speedy, vehicle-friendly route between the two peninsulas grew. As a result, Michigan established a ferry service between Mackinac City and St. Ignace in 1923, and within a few years, the fleet consisted of 9 boats that collectively carried thousands of vehicles back and forth every day. However, with each passing year, as automobiles became more affordable for working-class families, the ferries had a harder and harder time keeping up, and it became apparent that a more efficient and inexpensive solution was needed. On a per-car basis, ferries were exorbitantly costly to operate, and during the winter months, they shut down altogether. With the writing on the wall, in 1928, Governor Fred W. Greene ordered the state's Department of Transportation to look into whether a bridge was feasible. The following year, they concluded that it was, but that all told, planning, engineering, and construction would probably take the better part of a decade and cost about $30 million, which is about $400 million today. But as is often the case, initial projections significantly underestimated the overall cost. You are watching the Mega Projects channel after all. In the mid-1880s, a shopkeeper in St. Ignace published a newspaper article in which he detailed his vision for a bridge that might one day span the Straits of Mackinac. At about the same time, Michigan's legislature was debating the issue, and uber-rich railroad tycoon Cornelius Vanderbilt II proposed a similar bridge in a meeting with business associates on Mackinac Island. The wheels were turning, and everybody agreed that a new bridge would increase commerce and tourism and raise the living standards of countless families in the area. That said, the scheme ultimately languished on the proverbial back burner until the 1920s, when the state's highway commissioner reviewed various proposals that included everything from floating tunnels and suspension bridges to a mishmash of causeways running between islands. At least theoretically, each would connect the two sides of Michigan permanently. But it wouldn't be until 1934 until the legislature took action by creating the Mackinac Straits Bridge Authority. In the early going, the authority was tasked with figuring out which design was the most promising and how the project would be funded. Sadly, the nation was reeling from the ravages of the Great Depression, and though the federal government was doling out money for infrastructure projects on an unprecedented scale, the bridge just wasn't a priority, despite support from local business leaders, state politicians, the U.S. Corps of Engineers, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself. But though federal funding never materialized, between 1936 and 1940, the Bridge Authority received and reviewed additional proposals and commissioned various studies to determine the best route and economic impact of the proposed bridge. Initially, it was envisioned that the bridge would consist of a 3-lane roadway with a rail line slung underneath, the latter of which would have made Cornelius Vanderbilt II's jump for joy had he not already died. The route chosen allowed anchorage piers to be sunk in relatively shallow water, which would reduce the cost and speed up construction. On the downside, the bottleneck between the two Great Lakes was subject to high winds, ocean-like waves, and huge masses of ice that would put tremendous sustained pressure on bridge elements. Between 1939 and 1941, though funding hadn't been secured, a 4,000-plus foot, that's about 1,219-meter, concrete causeway was built from the north. But with the outbreak of the Second World War, work was halted while the country's industries and laborers turned their attention to more pressing matters. Though it pushed the project forward as much as could be expected under the circumstances, the Mackinac Straits Bridge Authority was abolished in 1947. But 3 years later, another, the Mackinac Bridge Authority, was created. By then, motorists typically had to wait 5 hours for ferry service, not including the trip itself, and collectively, the boats were only capable of transporting about 500 vehicles per hour, though the proposed bridge would be able to accommodate more than 4 times as many. Finally, realizing that they'd never get the money from the federal government, in early 1951, the state legislature authorized the sale of $85 million, that's about $700 million today, in bonds to fund the bridge's construction. However, thanks to one of the worst bond markets in history, the Korean War, scarce buyers, and difficulty finding an underwriter, the bond issuance was delayed for nearly 2 more years. Alright, so we'll get back to today's video in just a moment, but first, here's a word from today's video sponsor, DataCamp. DataCamp is an educational tool that provides its users with more than 300 courses and interactive learning experiences focused on fundamentals and applications in data science. Now you might be thinking, Simon, how does data analysis possibly apply to me? I'm not a math league nerd. Why is this relevant at all? What are you going on about? But, well, you got it all wrong. Data analysis isn't just about equations. It's a fundamental critical thinking skill that's sadly really underrepresented in most primary education programs. Nearly every sector in our modern economy needs to know how to read and interpret numbers, and DataCamp's small, bite-sized lessons and practical skill assessments can help you build your career toolbox. One course I might recommend if you're interested is Spreadsheet Fundamentals. You don't have to be an accountant to need a good spreadsheet every now and then, and Excel can be pretty intimidating if you've never been formally taught it. It's got tons of weird little secrets and features. This track in DataCamp is great for that. And if you get good enough in Excel or Google Sheets, then obviously this is something that could go on your resume and even lead to a whole new job. Brilliant. So if you're ready to unlock new career opportunities and become data fluent today, then you can click the link in the description box below and check out the first chapter of any DataCamp course for free. It's a great trial offer. Thank you, DataCamp, and back to today's video. In the early 1950s, renowned New York civil engineer David B. Steinman was hired to design the bridge, and much of his inspiration came from the Brooklyn Bridge that he saw every day growing up. Steinman's design was also influenced by lessons learned after the catastrophic failure of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state in 1940. After the disaster, which was caused by a deadly combination of high winds and inherent engineering flaws, Steinman published a lengthy critique of the bridge's design and put forth a number of solutions to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Namely, his bridge would include stiffer and deeper set trusses to support the deck, as well as numerous open areas through which wind from all directions could pass. It would also have a deck shaped like an airfoil to cut through the air efficiently, instead of acting like a giant sail. Together, these revolutionary elements allowed the bridge to withstand winds up to 150 miles per hour, 240 kilometers an hour. By the end of 1953, funding had been secured, Steinman's design had been finalized, cost estimates had been completed, and construction contracts had been awarded. U.S. Steel Corporation's American Bridge Division would erect the bridge, while the Merritt, Chapman, and Scott Corporation of New York would handle the site and substructural work. Construction officially got underway in early May 1954 using the previously built causeway as a starting point. Next, caissons were constructed, floated into position, and sunk to provide solid foundations on which the two immense towers would be anchored. Once these were in place, the dangerous, slow, and tedious work of stretching the cables and erecting the roadbeds by way of creeper derricks began. Larger truss sections were assembled off-site, transported by barge to the bridge, and raised into place. All told, more than 3,500 workers toiled on the bridge and 7,000 more labored at quarries, steel mills, and machinery shops all over the country. The blueprints and structural designs totaled nearly $1 million, and the bridge was built with 3.6 million tons of steel, 931,000 tons of concrete, 4.8 million rivets, and 2,000 miles of woven cable made up of 42,000 miles, that's 68,000 kilometers, of individual wires. At midspan, the roadway was 200 feet, that's 61 meters high, and the tallest towers rose more than 550 feet, 168 meters over the water below. All told, just 5 workers died during the construction, making the project one of the country's safest relative to its scope and overall cost. The first fatality occurred in mid-September 1954 when 46-year-old diver Frank Pepper ascended too quickly from nearly 150 feet below, and he died from the bends. The following month, 26-year-old James Lesage fell 40 feet into a partially completed concrete structure, sustaining a fatal head injury against exposed steel beams on the way down. 2 weeks later, a welder fell into the water and drowned after experiencing what was claimed to be a heart attack. Then, in June of 1956, 2 men died on the first day of the job after a catwalk collapsed near the North Tower. All 5 men are memorialized on a plaque at the park near the north end, but despite persistent rumors, none of them are interred in the bridge's concrete structures. Since then, the only other worker to perish on the bridge was Daniel Doyle, who fell from scaffolding in early August of 1997. Doyle actually survived the relatively short 70-foot, 21.3-meter fall, only to die from hypothermia in the chilly 50 Fahrenheit, 10 Celsius water shortly thereafter. In addition, at least 2 vehicles have plummeted over the sides of the bridge. In September 1989, Leslie Ann Pleur died when her car plunged over the short guardrail. Though high wind gusts were originally blamed, this finding wasn't supported by local meteorological measurements taken at the time. Later investigations determined that she'd simply been driving recklessly and lost control. Then in March of 1997, Richard Allen Darabin drove his car over the edge in an apparent suicide. The bridge was also the site of at least 2 aircraft incidents, the first of which was among the world's most epic aviation stunts, while the second was a fatal disaster. In late April 1959, Strategic Air Command Captain John S. Lapo flew his 6-engine, 100,000-pound Boeing B-47 Stratojet beneath the bridge, after which, big shocker here, he was court-martialed. In mid-September of 1970, during a particularly heavy fog, a small private plane with 3 U.S. Marine Reserve officers on board slammed into one of the bridge's suspension cables. The impact sheared both wings from the fuselage, after which the plane dropped like a stone into the water, killing all 3 men. Since the Mackinac Bridge isn't open to pedestrians, jumping suicides are rare, though there have been more than a dozen in the past few decades alone. All told, construction costs topped $700 million when inflation is accounted for. These days, the toll is $2 per axle for a passenger vehicle and $5 per axle for RVs and commercial vehicles. Maintenance is ongoing, and on average, it takes about 7 years to paint the bridge from top to bottom and end to end, after which the process immediately begins again. By 2005, about 11,700 vehicles per day traveled over the bridge, and 2 years later, a mammoth $300 million deck replacement project got underway. In 2009, the bridge logged its 150 millionth crossing, and the following year, it was designated designated a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Civil Engineers. In both 1958 and 2010, the United States Post Office issued stamps commemorating the Mackinac Bridge. The steel monster has also made a number of appearances in films and television shows, including a 90s PBS documentary titled Burning the Mighty Mac, the History Channel's Modern Marvels, and Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe. Though it's only an option once a year, it's possible to walk across the bridge every Labor Day, but only in the morning because Mighty Mac is too important to be shut down for more than a few hours. So I really hope you found today's video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.